What would you do if you were asked to give up a seat you desperately needed just to make way for someone with more status? Imagine sitting in the cramped back of a plane, your body aching from years of sacrifice, while others pass you by without a glance. This isn't just a story about a seat on a flight. It's about dignity, respect, and the invisible battles so many face every day. Meet Elijah Monroe, a quiet man with a lifetime of achievements whose presence in the sky is far more significant than most realize. A veteran engineer, a man who helped design the very systems keeping you safe when you fly. Yet, on this flight, he is pushed aside, forced into invisibility. Why do we so often overlook those who have given everything? What does it say about us when respect is replaced by convenience? And what happens when a pilot decides enough is enough? Join us as we unravel a story of quiet strength, unexpected courage, and a moment that changed the course of a flight and maybe, just maybe, how we see each other. If you believe everyone deserves to be seen and respected, like, share, and subscribe now. Let's dive in. The boarding area for North Sky Airlines Flight 729 was unusually quiet for a Thursday morning at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Gate 34 buzzed softly with hushed conversations and keyboard taps, early risers sipping coffee and scrolling through their phones. Among them sat Elijah Monroe, 76 years old, spine straight despite the pain, blazer neatly pressed, passport resting on his lap. He wore no medals, no insignia, just a simple button-down shirt, gray slacks, and shoes that had clearly traveled farther than most on the flight. He had arrived nearly 90 minutes early, not out of nervousness, but out of habit. A habit formed over decades working as a senior aerospace systems engineer back when arriving late to anything meant someone else might not arrive at all. The calm precision of early boarding was one of the few things that still gave him comfort. When they called Group 1, he rose slowly, the kind of slowness that isn't laziness, but legacy. The man moved with the calculated grace of someone who knew his body was no longer his ally, but he moved anyway. He offered a polite good morning to the gate agent, handed her the ticket he'd paid extra for months ago. Seat 1A, first class, left-hand window. It wasn't for prestige. It was for the extra lumbar support and direct aisle access. After 3 back surgeries and countless physical therapy sessions, 1A wasn't an upgrade. It was a requirement. As Elijah stepped into the jet bridge, he paused just long enough to let a younger couple with a stroller pass. He offered a soft smile, and the mother gave him a quick nod. No one else paid much attention. To most passengers, he looked like any other older man boarding early, someone who might fall asleep before takeoff and never touch the in-flight Wi-Fi. He didn't mind. Being invisible had become a sort of quiet shield over the years. But this morning, this one flight was different. Inside the aircraft, a fresh scent of citrus cleaning spray lingered under the hum of climate control. Elijah stepped into the front cabin and paused again. The first-class seats were plush, upholstered in navy and ash gray. He spotted his 1A, window, clean, waiting. He placed his small carry-on under the seat with care, folded his blazer over the armrest, and lowered himself slowly into the cushion. Relief came like exhale. He sank back gently and closed his eyes for a brief moment. No one around him noticed. Not the suited man flipping through emails in 1C. Not the 2 flight attendants organizing pre-boarding beverages in the galley. And certainly not the tall, anxious passenger pacing just outside the boarding door, arguing over a phone call. Elijah didn't know it yet, but a silent confrontation was on its way. One that had less to do with seating charts and everything to do with what society chooses to value, and who it chooses to forget. The seatbelt lay across his lap, unfastened for now. But what lay ahead, 9 minutes into this ordinary flight, would soon test the strength of something deeper than straps and buckles: his patience, his dignity, and the quiet power of being seen. The last group of passengers had just started trickling onto the aircraft. Luggage wheels bumped the seat edges, jackets brushed shoulders, and the air began to fill with that familiar blend of recycled oxygen, coffee, and tension. Elijah kept to himself in seat 1A, hands resting on his lap, eyes closed, not asleep, just still. Then came the voice, polite, crisp, practiced. "Excuse me, sir." He opened his eyes slowly and turned toward the aisle. A young flight attendant stood there, tablet in hand, posture stiff. Her name tag read, Camille Stone. She couldn't have been older than 30, her uniform sharp and uncreased, her bun tight like protocol. She smiled, but not warmly. It was the kind of smile built for diffusing complaints, not honoring presence. "Yes," Elijah replied gently. "Are you seated in 1A? I am." She shifted on her heels. "There's been an update to our seating arrangement. I'm going to need to ask you to move to seat 34B. A passenger with executive platinum status was just checked in and needs this seat." Elijah blinked. Once. Slowly. He sat up straighter, his spine protesting. "I booked this seat 3 months ago," he said. "It's medically necessary. You can check the notes. I called customer service twice to make sure it would be locked in. Camille didn't check." "I understand, sir," she said. Tone still smooth, "but the passenger has top-tier priority, and our policy is to accommodate them when needed." He tilted his head slightly. "At the cost of someone like me." There was a pause. It lasted barely a beat, but it was there. "I'm sorry," she said, "but we need to close the boarding door soon. Please collect your things and proceed to 34B. He didn't move. For a brief moment, the background noise of boarding quieted. The man in 1C lowered his phone slightly. The sound of suitcase wheels faded. Elijah looked down at his hands, old, calloused, steady. His breath deepened, as if bracing for a decision. "Is there no other seat?" he asked. "It's the only one available, sir." Elijah didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just nodded once, like someone used to swallowing discomfort, and began to reach for his blazer. "Let me help," Camille offered. He held up a palm. "No need." He rose carefully. His lower back flared with pain, but he didn't flinch. Not in front of an audience. Not again. With slow, dignified movements, he lifted his carry-on and began the long walk back. The aisle seemed narrower than before. Passengers watched but said nothing. Silence dripped like condensation from the air vents. Seat 34B. Back of the aircraft, middle seat, cramped, no armrest, no dignity. He lowered himself wordlessly, wedged between a teenager with headphones and a man in a business suit already taking over the shared space. Camille returned to the galley, her face unreadable. At the front of the plane, the new passenger, mid-40s, designer blazer, Bluetooth earpiece settled into 1A with an air of entitlement so thick it could stain the leather. Elijah closed his eyes again, but this time there was no peace, just ache, not only in his back, but somewhere deeper. He wasn't angry, not yet, but somewhere, in the echoing hollows of his silence, something had started to shift. Seat 34B. It wasn't just a number, it was a sentence. Middle seat, rear cabin, next to the lavatories. The hum of the engine was louder back here, vibrating through the thin plastic panels like a tired breath. The air had lost its citrus freshness and now smelled faintly of stale coffee, disinfectant, and recycled exasperation. Elijah Monroe lowered himself slowly, one hand gripping the headrest in front of him for balance. His spine tensed as he sank into the narrow cushion. The seat didn't give it resisted, like it knew he didn't belong there. To his right, a teenager wore oversized headphones, chewing gum, and watching something on his phone. He barely glanced at Elijah before turning further toward the window, pulling up his hood. To Elijah's left, a man in a gray business suit had already claimed both armrests and most of the legroom. His elbows formed a casual, careless barrier. Elijah sat still, back straight, shoulders slightly hunched to avoid touching either neighbor. There was nowhere for his knees to go, no aisle to stretch into. He shifted his weight every few minutes, trying to avoid the deep, throbbing pressure blooming from his lower back. It wasn't the pain that hurt most, it was the feeling of being small. In first class, he'd had space not just for his legs, but for his presence. There, he had a window, a whisper of dignity. Here, pressed between two indifferent strangers, he might as well have been cargo. No one asked if he was okay. No one noticed the slow, involuntary twitch in his leg when the cramps started. He didn't expect them to. He sat with his hands folded over his lap, knuckles weathered and pale. The leather band of his watch dug gently into his wrist, a quiet reminder that time was passing, but not fast enough. Above him, the overhead light flickered. A small stutter, then it blinked out entirely. A sign, maybe, or just a joke. He closed his eyes and let the rumble of the aircraft fill his ears. Somewhere, a baby was crying softly. Somewhere, a suitcase jammed as it tried to fit overhead. Elijah breathed slowly. He didn't feel anger, not yet. What he felt was resigned invisibility. It wasn't new. It was just heavier than usual. He thought about why he had booked this flight, why the seat mattered. His daughter had offered to fly out and pick him up. His doctor warned about long-haul sitting. But Elijah wanted to be there in person, to attend the National Aerospace Recognition Summit, not as a speaker, not as a guest of honor, but as a listener, as someone who, decades ago, had helped design a failsafe now used on every modern aircraft in the country, including this one. He wasn't looking for recognition. He just wanted not to be erased. That wish now felt foolish. Then, from 3 rows ahead, just beyond the plastic curtain, someone turned their head. A woman, mid-40s, neatly dressed, laptop closed, eyes alert. Jordan Reyes, director of engineering support at North Sky Airlines, had watched the exchange at the front earlier. She hadn't intervened then, but now she watched Elijah, the line of his back, the tight hold of his hands, the fatigue in his eyes, even when closed. She pulled out her phone, tapped a message, and sent it to Operations Command with a quiet sense of purpose. Some stories didn't need shouting. They just needed someone to notice. Jordan Reyes didn't usually pay attention to passengers. As Director of Engineering Support at North Sky Airlines, her job was rooted in systems mechanics, diagnostics, regulatory compliance, people that was someone else's department. But this felt different. She had boarded quietly, choosing her seat in row 17 aisle side, close enough to observe, far enough to disappear. A habit formed during years in aviation, where being present without being visible made it easier to spot what others missed. And she had seen it all. The way Elijah Monroe stood to let the platinum status man pass. The way his shoulders squared even when his eyes looked down. The silence that filled the space where someone should have spoken up. Jordan wasn't a sentimental person, but she knew the face of someone who had once been revered and now been forgotten. She knew it because she had worked with men like him, old engineers with steady hands and sharper minds than people half their age. Men who had drawn blueprints when pencils still mattered, whose calculations once determined whether hundreds of people lived or died. She remembered that name, Elijah Monroe. Not just from this flight manifest, but from internal legacy documents she once audited. The Monroe stabilizer algorithm was part of the aircraft's auto-thrust logic, still in use today. She was sitting on technology he had helped create, and now he was sitting in 34B like an afterthought. She tapped her phone, hesitating briefly before composing the message. To Ops Command, Internal Routing Flight 729, CCLT passenger Elijah Monroe. Reassigned from First Class 1A to 34B despite medical annotation. Legacy engineer, contributor to FAA-recognized stabilizer module. Cabin crew unresponsive to explanation. Please review and advise. Jordan Reyes, Der, Eng, Sup, North Sky. She hit send. The message wasn't angry. It was measured, precise, unignorable, just like the man it concerned. She sat back, screen dimmed, and stole another glance down the aisle. He hadn't moved, just a slight twitch in his left shoulder now and then a micro-adjustment for pain. Jordan knew what that meant. Her father had carried the same ache after a career in aircraft maintenance, the kind of pain that didn't show on scans but screamed in confined seats and cold air. A flight attendant passed by, offering pretzels and warm smiles to others. She didn't look at Elijah, didn't see him shifting, uncomfortable, shrinking. Jordan felt something stir, not rage, but responsibility. It wasn't just about a seat. It was about how easily systems forget the very people who built them. She could have looked away. That's what most people did, but the cabin was too small now, the story too clear. Her silence wouldn't protect her from complicity, not this time. As the flight crew prepared for pushback and passengers buckled in, Jordan leaned back in her seat. She didn't expect the plane to stop. She didn't expect her message to ripple upward. But she had done something. And sometimes, that's where change begins with someone who quietly refuses to let the story end the wrong way. In the sealed quiet of the Flight 729 cockpit, Captain Howard Briggs adjusted the trim setting on the center console and scanned the final takeoff checklist. The co-pilot, a younger man named Raines, recited altitude callouts with methodical precision. The pre-flight routine was humming like clockwork, exactly how Howard preferred it. After 30 years in aviation, Captain Briggs had grown to trust silence, not the absence of sound, but the calm in knowing every system is working as it should. But then, something pinged. A soft chime from the notification module embedded in the overhead display. It wasn't a technical warning. It was a direct flag from North Sky Internal Systems. He frowned and tapped it. Passenger report escalation priority internal review, flagged PAX. Elijah Monroe, seat reassigned from 1A to 34B notes. Medically annotated, legacy contributor to FMS design protocols. Submitter, Jordan Reyes. Director, Engineering Support Relevant System Contributor, NTS Algorithm V2, Captain Briggs, blinked once, then twice. That name. Elijah Monroe. He hadn't heard it in years, but he knew it. The Monroe name was etched into every pilot's recurrent training, even if most didn't notice. It was on the back end of flight stabilization software, the very code that allowed them to manage thrust and turbulence more precisely during final approach. He remembered reading about Monroe during his first year as a captain. A brilliant but quiet mind. Former lead systems engineer on the NTS module, whose override logic had prevented at least 2 major commercial incidents in the early 2000s. And now that same man was sitting in the back of his plane in a middle seat, because someone with more miles and louder demands wanted 1A Howard's jaw tightened. He didn't usually interfere with passenger logistics. That was cabin crew territory. But this was different. Hold position, he said, reaching for the headset mic. Grounds cleared us to taxi. Raines replied, Tell them we need 5, maybe 10. Raines raised a brow. Everything okay? Captain Howard already unbuckled his harness. "Not yet," he muttered. "But it will be." He stepped out of his seat, straightened the cuffs of his jacket, and smoothed the 3 gold stripes on his shoulder. He reached for the cabin intercom switch, held it down, and spoke. "Lead cabin. This is Captain Briggs. Please stand by. I'll be stepping out momentarily." He released the button, grabbed the flight manifest, and opened the cabin door. A small wave of surprise rolled through the front rows as he emerged. The lead flight attendant, Arlene, met him just outside the galley. "Captain, I need to locate a passenger," he said calmly. "Elijah Monroe. He's been moved from 1A to 34B. She blinked, surprised. The older gentleman, "We had a VIP arrive late, and I've read the report." Her mouth opened slightly, but she said nothing. Howard nodded. "I'll find him." The tone in his voice wasn't harsh, but it had weight. The kind of weight that doesn't demand obedience, only truth. He wasn't here to blame. He was here to fix. As he began walking down the aisle slowly, purposefully, the cabin fell into a curious hush. Passengers turned their heads. The whir of overhead bins faded beneath the click of his polished shoes. The captain was coming. And for Elijah Monroe, still seated in silence in 34B, his eyes closed and his back stiff. He had no idea the sky had just started to shift, not from turbulence, but from justice. The aisle of Flight 729 had never felt longer. Captain Howard Briggs moved deliberately. His steps measured not by impatience, but by intention. His posture remained calm, but his presence altered the energy in the cabin. Passengers leaned sideways to watch. Conversations tapered off. Cell phones dipped. Even the fidgety toddler in row 9 stilled in his mother's lap. Something about the man walking toward the back of the plane, gold stripes glinting in cabin light, made everyone pause. 3 rows from the rear, Howard spotted him. Elijah Monroe, seated in 34B, sat perfectly upright. His eyes were closed again, not in rest, but in resignation. Shoulders squared, hands folded tightly on his lap. A quiet sculpture of discomfort. The businessman to his left had pulled out a laptop. The teenager to his right was slumped deeper into his hoodie. Neither of them noticed the captain approach. But Elijah did. He felt the stillness shift. Slowly. His eyes opened. They flicked to the shadow now falling across him. And there stood Captain Briggs. "Mr. Monroe?" Howard asked, voice low, firm, but filled with respect. Elijah looked up, unsure. Yes, Howard extended a hand, not for shaking, but in recognition. "My name is Howard Briggs. I'm the captain of this aircraft, and I believe we've made a mistake." Elijah didn't respond at first, not because he was angry, but because he was surprised. Surprised that anyone had noticed. That anyone cared. Howard continued. "I was just alerted to the situation regarding your seat reassignment and to your legacy." The word caught Elijah off guard. Legacy. Howard leaned in slightly, blocking out the rest of the row. "I've flown 737s, 787s, and this aircraft right here because of systems you helped build. Monroe Stabilizer Logic, NTS Override Protocol. They trained us on it, still do." The edges of Elijah's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close to disbelief. Howard gestured toward the front of the plane. "I'd like to personally escort you back to 1A, sir, if you'll allow me." Elijah's lips parted, hesitant. "I don't want to cause trouble," he murmured. "You're not," Howard said. "You're correcting it." Behind them, the aisle had grown quiet. Even the businessman beside Elijah shifted uncomfortably in his seat, registering the moment. Howard turned, scanning the cabin. "Ms. Stone," he called softly. Camille Stone, the flight attendant who had initiated the reassignment, emerged from the galley near row 26. Her eyes widened as she approached. Yes, Captain. You'll assist Mr. Monroe in returning to his original seat. Howard said, still calm. She hesitated. But, sir, if 1A is now occupied, then you'll ask for a volunteer. If none come forward, inform them that the captain is requesting that seat be returned to the man who helped make this aircraft fly. Camille's face flushed. She nodded. Yes, Captain. Elijah slowly stood. A slight wince passed over his face, and his right hand braced against the seat in front of him. Howard reached out and gently supported his elbow. You don't have to do this, Elijah whispered, his voice laced with decades of swallowed battles. I do, Howard replied. Steady. We all do. Together. They turned toward the front, and as they began walking row by row, aisle by aisle, passengers watched in utter silence. They weren't watching a man move seats. They were watching something be restored. They moved slowly. Elijah Monroe walked upright but cautious, each step deliberate as the tight pain in his back pulsed beneath his ribs. At his side, Captain Howard Briggs matched his pace, never letting go of the steadying touch under Elijah's elbow. The aisle, once a narrow corridor, had become a quiet stage. Heads turned, whispers caught in throats. Eyes tracked them not with the usual impatience of boarding delays, but with a weight no one could name just yet. Elijah passed row 22, where a young woman touched her chest with an open palm, a silent gesture of respect. He passed row 15, where an older man slowly removed his baseball cap. He passed row 10, where a child asked his mother, "Mommy, is that man a hero?" She didn't answer right away. At row 3, the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane was gently pulled aside by Camille Stone. Her face was pale now, the confident script of protocol erased by something she hadn't expected consequence. Camille looked at Captain Briggs, searching his face for guidance. "Seat 1A," he said softly. She swallowed, then turned toward the current occupant, a man in his 40s, expensive jacket, noise-canceling headphones, sipping sparkling water. He looked up, annoyed. "I'm sorry," Camille said, voice tighter than before. "We need to reassign this seat. The captain has requested it be returned to the original passenger." The man's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me." He turned and saw Elijah. He didn't need an explanation. The lines on Elijah's face, the calm in his posture, the glint of history unspoken behind those tired eyes. Slowly, the man removed his headphones and stood. "Sir," he said quietly, "it's yours." Elijah dipped his head, murmured, "Thank you." No drama, no outrage, just a shift in energy, a small, solemn justice. As Camille stepped aside, Elijah moved into 1A with care. The leather seat welcomed him like an old friend. He sank back, not in relief, but in restoration. Captain Briggs turned to the first 6 rows. He didn't speak loudly, but everyone heard him. "If this seat hadn't been given, I would have reassigned the co-pilot's jump seat, and if that hadn't worked, I would have given him mine." Silence, then a single clap, followed by another, and another. But it wasn't applause for entertainment. It was recognition. For something many had witnessed, but hadn't understood until now. Camille stepped back into the galley, tablet clutched against her chest like a confession. The curtain closed, and with it, the weight of one silent injustice finally undone. As Elijah settled back into seat 1A, something shifted, not just in him, but in the atmosphere of the entire cabin. He had lived with quiet dignity for decades, but the walk back down the aisle had been more than just a physical movement. It was a slow, deliberate reclaiming of a place in a world that had been too eager to overlook him. Passengers watched not out of curiosity or inconvenience, but with a growing sense of respect. Eyes that once darted away now held steady, and nods of acknowledgement rippled through the rows. Elijah's steps had been careful, weighted with pain, but also a newfound strength. Each footfall seemed to echo years of silent sacrifice. A middle-aged woman sitting near row 12 whispered to her companion, "That man, he built the very planes we fly on." Her voice was soft but reverent. The businessman in row 9, who had earlier encroached on Elijah's space, now lowered his gaze and shifted slightly, as if humbled by the presence of history walking by. The teenager with headphones nodded slowly, removing one earbud to listen not to music, but to the unspoken story in Elijah's measured pace. Even the flight attendants paused briefly in their duties, their eyes reflecting an unspoken apology. Jordan Reyes, still seated quietly in row 17, allowed herself a small, proud smile. She had sent the message that set this change in motion, but the real recognition was happening here among the people sharing this space. Elijah felt the weight of gazes, but carried it with grace. For once, he wasn't invisible. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered that justice was more than an abstract concept. It was this moment, this acknowledgement, this simple, powerful walk through the aisles of a plane. He reached the front cabin and paused, looking down the rows of first-class seats, the leather cushions, the soft lighting. They all seemed to welcome him home. Captain Howard Briggs stood nearby, watching with steady eyes, as if silently endorsing Elijah's passage back to dignity. Elijah settled fully into 1A, letting the familiar space cradle him. He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was a man whose life's work, whose sacrifices, were finally being seen. A ripple of quiet applause began soft at first, then spreading, not loud or boastful, but sincere. Passengers clapped not just for the man in the seat, but for what he represented: resilience, honor, and the slow but inevitable righting of wrongs. Elijah lowered his head briefly, feeling the unspoken connection with those around him. The journey was far from over, but at this moment, in this sky-bound capsule, something precious had been restored. The cabin remained hushed, the gentle applause still lingering like a soft wave fading at the shore. Elijah Monroe sat quietly in seat 1A, his hands resting on the armrests, the familiar leather comforting beneath his fingers. Then, from the row behind, a clear voice cut through the silence. "Sir, you don't remember me, do you?" Elijah turned his head slowly. A young man stood there, leaning slightly on the seat in front of him. He was in his late 20s, wearing a simple blue jacket, eyes bright but tinged with emotion. "I'm Caleb Turner," the man continued, voice steady but shaking. "I was a junior engineer at Hawthorne Labs when you were mentoring us. You saved my career and my life." Elijah's eyes softened, searching Caleb's face for recognition. "You spoke to us about integrity, about how the small things like a line of code or a steady hand can save thousands. I never got to thank you properly." Caleb's voice cracked, the weight of unspoken gratitude pressing in. He looked down, then back up, courage gathering in his gaze. "I owe you everything. When my project was failing, when others doubted me, you stood by me. You believed in me. You showed me what real leadership looks like." Elijah swallowed hard. His throat tightened with a mixture of surprise and pride. "You were never invisible to us," Caleb said softly. "And today, seeing what happened, it reminded me that the world still needs to learn that lesson." For a moment, the cabin felt suspended in time. The younger passengers, the business travelers, even the flight crew all seemed to listen, drawn into this moment between two generations. Elijah nodded slowly, a faint smile breaking through the weariness. "Thank you, Caleb," he whispered. "That means more than you know." Caleb smiled back, eyes glistening with quiet tears. He took his seat, the hush settling once more. Captain Howard Briggs caught the exchange from the cockpit door and allowed himself a small nod. The legacy Elijah carried wasn't just in the software or the awards, it was in the lives he had touched, the people he had inspired, and in that moment, surrounded by strangers who had become witnesses, Elijah Monroe wasn't just a man who'd been displaced. He was a beacon. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a calm glow over the rows of passengers. Captain Howard Briggs stepped to the intercom, his voice steady and clear, filling every corner of the aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before we begin our journey, I want to address something important." A hush fell over the cabin. Phones were put down. Conversations paused. Every eye turned toward the front, drawn not just by his rank, but by the weight in his words. Today, a mistake was made. He paused, allowing those words to sink in. A man who has dedicated his life to the safety and innovation of this very aircraft was asked to give up his seat. Not because of oversight, but because of a policy that prioritizes status over service. Captain Briggs's gaze swept across the cabin, meeting eyes some surprised, some ashamed, many reflective. Staff Sergeant Elijah Monroe is more than a passenger on this flight. He is a veteran of countless battles in the skies of technology and engineering. A man whose work ensures that we fly safely, no matter the turbulence outside. The applause that followed was slow at first, then grew, heartfelt and sincere. Not the hollow clapping of staged events, but the genuine recognition of sacrifice and dignity. The captain continued, voice firm yet compassionate. "We will not take off while injustice sits quietly among us." Elijah did not ask for special treatment only to be seen, respected, and honored for his service. He glanced toward Elijah, who sat quietly, absorbing the moment without a word. "As your captain, I take responsibility for what happened today. I promise you, this North Sky Airlines will learn from this. We will do better." The cabin erupted into applause again, this time louder, waves of appreciation rolling from the back to the front. Jordan Reyes smiled quietly in her seat, knowing her message had sparked this moment. Camille Stone, standing near the front, looked down at her folded hands, a mixture of remorse and newfound respect in her eyes. Elijah finally lifted his head, eyes meeting those of his fellow passengers, not as a man displaced, but as one restored. Captain Briggs concluded, "Thank you for your attention. Now, please sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight." The intercom clicked off, and a warm wave of gratitude lingered in the air. The plane touched down smoothly at Charlotte Douglas International Airport, the wheels kissing the runway with a gentle hum that felt like a quiet blessing after the emotional storm aboard. Inside the cabin, passengers began gathering their belongings, their faces softer now marked by a shared experience that transcended the flight. Elijah Monroe remained seated in 1A, hands resting calmly on his knees. There was no rush in his movements, no hurry to disembark. For once, he felt truly seen, not just as a passenger, but as a man whose presence mattered. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering polite smiles and heartfelt thanks. When one of them approached Elijah, she didn't just speak out of habit. "Thank you, sir, for flying with North Sky," she said gently, meeting his eyes with genuine respect. Elijah nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. At the jet bridge, Jordan Reyes stepped forward as Elijah emerged. Without a word, she reached out and touched his shoulder, a small gesture, but waited with meaning. "You reminded us all," she whispered. Outside, waiting near baggage claim, Elijah's daughter, Maya, stood tall in her professional attire, holding a handmade sign that read, "Welcome home." Dad. When Elijah limped toward her, she dropped the sign and ran. The hug that followed was full force, a wave crashing against a seawall. "You're back," Maya said, eyes wide with concern. "I've had worse," Elijah replied with a tired but genuine smile. They walked together, talking softly about her new job, his upcoming plans, and the unexpected journey on the plane. Later that night, Maya showed Elijah a video on her phone, a clip of Captain Briggs's announcement that had already gone viral online. Tears welled up in her eyes. Elijah watched quietly, feeling the weight of a long-forgotten honor restored not just for himself, but for all who had ever felt unseen. The days after the flight unfolded slowly, like a gentle ripple spreading across still waters. Elijah Monroe sat in his study, an old wooden desk cluttered with papers, blueprints, and a framed photo of his younger self in a lab coat. The letter he held felt heavier than paper, sealed with the official emblem of North Sky Airlines. Inside was a formal apology from the airline's CEO, acknowledging the mishandling of his seating and honoring him as a lifetime guest of honor. No more fees, no more battles to justify his place. But it wasn't the letter that moved him the most. There was a second envelope, smaller and handwritten. He opened it carefully. The note inside bore the signature of General James Lockhart, a name Elijah recognized faintly from his military days. The letter spoke of a forgotten act of valor from decades ago, a time when Elijah, despite a grievous injury, had saved fellow soldiers under fire. "Your courage was never invisible to those who mattered." The letter read, "I am one of the many who owe their lives to your sacrifice." Elijah folded the letter twice, setting it beside a small flag on his desk. For the first time in a long time, silence felt full, not empty. Meanwhile, miles away, Jordan Reyes sat at her laptop, drafting the story of the flight. She wrote plainly, no embellishment, no dramatics, just the truth of what she had witnessed. Her article was picked up by a regional news outlet, then spread nationally, sparking conversations about respect, dignity, and the quiet battles many face unseen. Messages poured in thanks, stories, reflections from veterans, engineers, and everyday people. Elijah rarely responded, but when he did, his words were simple. "We remember, that is all." He returned to his routine morning walks, black coffee, quiet evenings on the porch. Yet something inside him had changed. He walked taller. He didn't flinch when strangers approached. And sometimes, when the sun dipped low behind the hills, he smiled. Not from pride, but because he knew. Honor doesn't fade. It just waits for the right moment to rise again. And when it does, even a seat on a plane becomes something sacred. Elijah's story is a powerful reminder that dignity cannot be measured by a seat number or status. It's in the respect we give and the respect we demand. Today, we witnessed how a single act of courage and recognition can restore not just a seat, but a person's honor. Discrimination, indifference, and forgetting those who paved the way for us is a wound deeper than any physical ache. But as Elijah showed us, when we stand up not just for ourselves, but for others, we create ripples that reach far beyond a single moment. If this story touched your heart, if it made you reflect on how we treat those around us, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories of justice, kindness, and humanity to light. Don't miss our next video, where we continue to honor the quiet heroes and challenge the injustices hiding in everyday life. Thank you for watching, and remember, every act of kindness matters, and every voice deserves to be heard.